The U.S. has now submitted a draft resolution to the United Nations Security Council. It's the first time calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. It would be tied to the release of the hostages, so it's not what the rest of the UN Security Council has been demanding. This brings the U.S., though, closer to the rest of the world, which has preferred. This is the humanitarian crisis in Gaza has been approaching catastrophic levels of starvation, with children now dying from hunger, adding to the urgency to pause the fighting.
That would bring immediate relief to so many people.
He was traveling with Secretary Blinken in Egypt. And with me here in the studio is Professor Guy Ziv, an associate professor at American University School of International Service. He's the author of the book, Netanyahu versus the Generals, The Battle for Israel's Future. Raf, first to you, Secretary Blinken, is you hearing?
Yeah, Andrea, Secretary Blinken says he believes the gaps between Israel and Hamas are narrowing and that he believes a deal is still possible. Now, we heard the Qataris, the mediators throughout this crisis, saying earlier this week that they are cautiously optimistic about the progress that is being made at the negotiating table. I got to tell you, neither Israel nor Hamas are sounding anywhere near as positive as the Americans or the Qataris. That is perhaps to be expected, both sides trying to improve their negotiating positions and also looking to blame the other if these talks collapse. The talks have not collapsed so far, both sides remaining at the table. Secretary Blinken says he will keep pushing, the U.S. will keep pushing to try to get this deal over the line. As we have talked about many times, the broad outlines of this deal have been known for some time. At least in the first stage, there would be a 6-week ceasefire, the release of roughly 40 hostages being held by Hamas in exchange for potentially several hundred Palestinian prisoners. And Andrea, it may be that for the Biden administration, this Security Council resolution is a way of piling pressure on all sides at these talks in Doha and really trying to make the point that it is the will of the international community at this point for there to be a deal, for there to be a ceasefire, for those hostages to come out, and for more humanitarian aid to get in. Andrew.
Indeed. And Michael Crowley, you've been traveling really around the world right now with Secretary Blinken, who's been in Asia, now come here. This is his 6th trip to the Middle East, has been doing these shuttles. And there's a level of frustration because of the tension between Prime Minister Netanyahu and the president. Do you see what's happening at the UN as one possible point of leverage? Because it does increase, notably, some more pressure on Israel when they are still reluctant to condition arms deliveries. Canada has, but they are still, I'm told in the White House, not ready to do that if the Prime Minister does go into Rafah.
Well, Andrea, yeah, it's been we've been with the Secretary of State for about a week now. We came in from Saudi Arabia this morning. Before that, the Philippines and South Korea. On the UN, yes, it is some leverage, but honestly, you know, the administration has been framing its rhetoric about a potential ceasefire in recent weeks around pressuring Hamas and trying to make the argument, almost trying to reframe the way people are talking about this and say that Hamas is as responsible as Israel is for the fact that the hostages are not getting out, that the fighting is not stopping, and trying to turn the lens on Hamas. And I also think that whatever other reasoning the administration might have, I think it clearly serves, let's be honest, a political motive, which is that the U.S. has been isolated at the United Nations, stopping resolutions calling for an indefinite, open-ended, long-term ceasefire that would require Israel to stop its military campaign in Gaza, regardless of what Hamas does. The administration is now essentially saying, you know, we're actually for a ceasefire, but in reality, this is a temporary ceasefire. It's what the administration until several weeks ago was calling a humanitarian pause, because it's a limited ceasefire. It's not telling Israel, stop it, no more fighting, no matter what, and we'll figure it out after that. So it serves, I think, a political purpose for the Biden administration to put itself in the position of kind of trying to call for peace after having been perceived as thwarting international calls for a stop to the fighting. And it gets mixed up in this terminology. Again, the difference between a ceasefire, which can be open-ended, and really what we're talking here about, which is more of a pause in the fighting.
And I want to also get into some of the politics here. First with you, Guy, because the Prime Minister is apparently, he talked to the Republican caucus, the Senate caucus yesterday, and he's apparently, Michael Johnson, the Speaker, is now inviting him to address Congress. That's what Netanyahu did, which so offended the Obama White House, because he came without warning and without any prior notice to the White House that he was coming to address a joint session that's usually done between leaders at the leader level, and he came to oppose the Iran nuclear talks. And now he's coming to make his case about what's happening with Gaza, when there is growing pressure from the administration to do something about the humanitarian situation. They believe that Israel is blocking a lot of the aid from more easily getting in through another land crossing. What is your analysis?
Well, for one thing, we have to consider domestic politics both here and in Israel. And this discussion with the Republican leadership comes in the wake of Chuck Schumer's speech a week ago. Senator Schumer, the majority leader, is the highest-ranking Jewish official in the United States, has a stalwart record in support of Israel, has rarely issued any sort of public condemnations of Israel, but called on Israelis to hold elections early and decide for themselves what kind of leader they need. He was very critical of Netanyahu, and so there was some criticism of the senator for intervening in Israeli politics. As you just pointed out, Netanyahu has done that on plenty of occasions, including his speech in front of a joint session of Congress on the eve of President Obama's signature foreign policy achievement, which was the JCPOA. I should note that despite the controversy of Schumer's speech, he had the full backing not only of President Biden and Nancy Pelosi and other prominent Democratic leaders. In Israel, a group of former retired Air Force pilots, it's called the 555 Forum, issued a statement in full support of Senator Schumer's statement, and as did former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. So there is some support in Israel for reining in Netanyahu, and Israelis are very uncomfortable with the notion that Israel is becoming a kind of partisan football. There was a traditional, strong bipartisan support for Israel, and that's been changing in recent years, in part because of Netanyahu.
And Michael, I want to ask you about the fact that the appropriations bill, I don't know if you've had time to look at it because they're still reading it, but this massive bill zeroes out the money for UNRWA, for the UN Relief Organization, that according to the Secretary of State, has unique capability to get aid from the borders, from the crossings to the interior, to the people who really need it in Gaza.
Andrea, that's going to be a huge challenge. There's not really any other organization. There is no other organization that has the infrastructure that can provide that aid to people in Gaza. So we're in a really difficult position. If Congress is saying no money for UNRWA, the U.S. is saying they'll try to find alternatives, but they don't exist right now. You would have to create them. You would have to stand them up, and you're going to create them. It's going to have to be run by the people of Gaza, many of whom have affiliations with Hamas. You may bump into similar problems. I honestly don't know how this one gets solved. It's a really tough one, and it comes at a really dire moment for the people of Gaza. Just not another obstacle that they need to getting life-saving aid and supplies.
And guys, I want to ask you about the title of your book, Netanyahu versus the Generals, because that has been a recurring theme since October 7th. And actually during the protests a year before, a lot of military joined the anti-Netanyahu protests against his trying to overturn the separation of the judicial system, as you know. And it would surprise some people in Washington when opposition leader, Minister Gant, came 2 weeks ago here and supported the ground invasion of Rafah because they thought that he is the potential alternative if there were elections or even interim government after Netanyahu. But he is also hardline on getting those 4 battalions of Hamas out. Is there a division in the military now over the actual battleground offensive that the U.S. says alternatives should be used to a ground offensive that would, have potentially mass casualties?
Look, the goal of eliminating, destroying Hamas is shared by nearly everyone in Israel. And I would add the United States as well, or at least the Biden administration. The question is, what can be done to weaken Hamas? Netanyahu's pledge for total victory is simply unrealistic, and that's not something that the military establishment in Israel believes is feasible. Both the political and the military establishment greatly underestimated both Hamas's abilities and willingness to attack Israel, and that is in large part what led to the surprise attack on October 7th. But there is definitely a crisis of confidence in Netanyahu. There's a big gap between the security community in Israel and Netanyahu, and that's why I wrote this book, because Netanyahu has this image that he's cultivated over the years as Mr. Security, and this is a reputation that he's had for decades, yet the Israeli security establishment has never bought into that and has seen him as more of a security liability rather than a security asset. And I think we're seeing more and more of that play out today in the wake of the Gaza war, in the wake of the October 7th massacre, and as you pointed out, also in last year's judicial reform fight.
Guy Ziv from American University, it's very good to have you here. Thanks
for having me.
And Ralph Sanchez, of course, and Michael Crowley.